Good day. Here I am, or here we are again for another episode of the Coaching Excellence Podcast. I'm Coach DuWayne Campbell, and today I have the honor and privilege of interviewing one of my favorite coaching mentors, Coach Dan Pfaff. He has coached multiple Olympians, multiple world championship medalists, multiple world record holders. This is something that I, at this point, can only aspire to and hope that I can learn and continue learning from Coach Pfaff, and you as well, partaking in the podcast, can learn from Coach Pfaff. So without further ado, Coach Dan Pfaff, welcome to the show, and would like to know from you how you got into coaching.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I really respect what you're doing with these podcasts and how you're trying to influence coaching and the quality of coaching. I think my coaching career started when I was a youth, if you will. So I grew up in the country where we didn't have a lot of guys and we had to invent games and adaptations of games and whatnot. So I was always kind of the organizer on, how come, we got five guys, we can't play baseball with five guys. So how do we break the field down and find a way to play baseball with five guys? Or we got three guys, how can we play a basketball game or something like that? So I was always kind of an organizer and a chess piece mover, even as a youth. And then growing up through high school, I wasn't a stellar athlete. I made the team. I was usually a starter, but, I wasn't a rock star or anything. And I think because I had background limitations and physical limitations, I started studying the sport and how coaches were coaching the sport, trying to find, an advantage to keep my role on the team. So I was studying coaches and coaching, even while I was in a youth. Then when I went away to university, I volunteered at my previous high school, and I volunteered in football and wrestling and track and field. Track and field was my love and probably my best sport. So it started out in a voluntary role. And then when I finished university, I became a classroom teacher. I taught sciences, physics, chemistry, earth science, things like that. And back then, you were a generalist, and I think that's been a big part of my success. I grew up on a farm, and my dad had a construction company, so you had to wear a lot of hats. In construction, you had to know wiring and electricity and plumbing and roofing and framing and cement and so tiling and what have you. And then on the farm, you had to know livestock and crops and plowing and how to repair machines. So I was pretty fortunate that I was a generalist from the get-go. And then I grew up in an era in the 60s where you did whatever sport was in season. So I played American football, I wrestled, I played basketball, I played ice hockey in a factory league, played baseball, ran track and field. So I got a broad exposure to a lot of sports and started to see common denominators and similarities in these sports. Like each sport wasn't all that different. And so that continued when I was a high school coach. I was a science teacher, like I said. I coached football, wrestling, intramural program, track and field program, summer conditioning. I was kind of the strength coach before strength coach was even a thing. And I was probably the athletic trainer or physio because, I knew how to tape ankles and things like that. So I was in charge of rehab. So I think I was really, really fortunate to grow up in the era that I did and have the people around me and have the opportunities to coach. And I think in this day and age, coaches specialize probably way too soon. Like I'm a sprint hurdle coach at age 19. I'm like, wow, well, there's a lot more to the sport and physical culture and training and programming out there than just that narrow hallway. So I encourage people to be a little bit more diverse and a generalist. From high school coaching, I went to the University of Houston as a grad student, and I mentored under Tom Tellez, the famous coach, Carl Lewis, Leroy Burrell, guys like that. And Coach T was a tremendous educator, very simple programming, biomechanist, demanded strict adherence to a technical model. And so I spent 2 years there kind of studying what I consider an Einstein of the sport. And then he kicked me out of the nest, and I started my journey as a university coach. I went to Wichita State, in Kansas for a year, at UTEP for 2 years, where I got exposed to a lot of international athletes. I was a head women's coach and men's field event coach there. And then I moved to LSU for 11 years, where we built that program from ground zero. And then I moved to the University of Texas for 8 years, and then finally Florida for 2 years. And then I've been in private practice probably the last 20 years.
Awesome, coach. That's a long time to be out there in the coaching field, and I'm sure you've gathered a lot of really great insights to share with us. You mentioned Tom Tellez and his biomechanics approach to coaching the sprints, or coaching in general when you were young. Who are some of your other major influences as a coach?
Well, I'd say on par with Coach T would be Victor Lopez, our friend from Puerto Rico, who started the NACAC in the coaching ed program there and has been an IAAF council member. Victor and I were grad students at Houston at the same time. And what Victor brought to me is a little different perspective. He was coached by coaches in Puerto Rico that were influenced by Calvesi and Vittori in Italy. So he kind of had that Italian input and programming mindset. But Victor was a musician, and Coach T was like strict science, and Victor was kind of art. And so it taught me the value of that coaching truly is part science and part art. And I was probably biased to the science because I was a science teacher and whatnot. And maybe my bedside manner, my communication, and how I looked at certain qualities or correcting certain qualities could gain from being the artist end of things. So I'll give you an example. Work with the football academy here in Austin, and we tried some cues on some kids, and the academy has a large Hispanic cohort in it. And so I thought, well, maybe a rhythm cue would really work on this problem that we were working in. So we talked about up-tempo staccato on acceleration, bump, 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 boom. That was magic. So I was using all this science on these academy guys, and it wasn't getting through. And the minute I went to the art, bingo. So part of my chase when I work with a new athlete is, what is their operating paradigm? Are they more mathematic or are they more artistic? And that influences, some of my pedagogical approach to how I teach and cue and instruct and even design programs.
Awesome, coach. You mentioned the coaching education a while ago briefly. Can you talk a little bit about what the influence, or what kind of influence coaching education has on developing coaching expertise? Being a part of Altis, which is very big on coaching ed and has a lot of different courses that, even myself, I've been able to benefit from. What role do you think coaching education or continuing coaching education has to play in the development of our expertise as coaches?
Well, my ancestry was German, and my grandfather taught in parables. And one that really stuck with me is that if you got a big lake and you want that water to stay clear and pristine and whatnot, you got to have water that comes into it and water that goes out. And I think a lot of times in coaches, we're on the outside. We're always giving things out and teaching and whatnot. We're letting water out, but my question is, how much water are we letting in the lake? So I value continuing education a lot. And, I've been in the business 50 years, and I learn things every day from the network and the diversity of network that influences my coaching practice. And, I'm always stepping back and say, wow, I wish I'd have known this 30 years ago, or wow, that would have made a huge difference. So I think coaching education is super important. I grew up in an era where it didn't exist. So in the 60s and early 70s, a coach maybe went to a clinic or a workshop and there were a couple a year, or maybe you had journals that you read. This is pre-internet, so the information coming in was not very vast at all. And now in your generation, it's overload. The internet's just flooding you with Instagram and TikTok and trying to decide what to do. So I think one of the values in continuing education is it helps coaches become a better consumer of what information they take in and how to, manage that information and discern whether it's valid or it's usable, or is it just sexy and a trend. In 50 years of coaching, I've seen a lot of sexy trends like Swiss ball workouts and isokinetic machine testing and you name it. And we call it flavor of the month. I've seen a lot of flavor of the months. And the one thing that I do is I track programming and philosophy and pedagogy and coaching, and the essentials are the essentials. So like if you're coaching a 100-meter sprinter, you got block clearance, block setup, and how you make your move on that first step. And then you got the acceleration steps and the transition steps and the upright speed steps, and then the speed endurance decay at the end of the race. Those are constants. Now, how you address those and whatnot, that's kind of the art of coaching. But it's easy to get lost where if all you're doing is working on the excursion of the block clearance or acceleration, you're leaving money on the table. And I think a lot of people become tribalist in social media, so I'm in this camp or I'm on this camp or whatnot. And I think sometimes we need to step back and just see the big picture. And that's what I think coaching education and having a good mentor does. It serves as a filtering system for what you're intaking and mulling over and trying to experiment with. We kind of have a rule at Altus that every year's programming is about 80-85% of what we know works. And then maybe 10% where people in our network are kind of experimenting or looking at things, and then maybe 5% something way out there. And I think there are a lot of young coaches that just revamp things every year, and you never know what's working or why it's working or if it didn't work, or maybe it needed a longer period of incubation before it worked. And so I see that happening a lot in young coaches. They'll try something out for 3 or 4 weeks, they don't get the desired effect, and they throw it away. Maybe they were on the edge of these kids figuring it out and breaking through, but they pulled the plug on it too soon. So we talk a lot about incubation period. Once you introduce an idea or a nudge to a problem, how long does it take for that program and that idea and that concept to percolate in the athlete and become a habit or, a reflexive response? So long story short, continuing ed to me keeps your brain clean, and it helps you filter just massive amounts of information that's coming in.
Awesome, Coach. You spoke about coaching mentorship. If you were, let me just throw this at you. If you were to be able to go back in time, build a time machine and you go back to when you were starting out as a coach, and you could mentor yourself on only, basically correct yourself on 3 things that would help you develop faster as a coach. Just three big rock principles that you could change immediately and accelerate your development as a coach. What 3 things would you have gone back in time?
The first and most obvious was I grew up in an era in the 60s where it was top down, so it's kind of military driven. The boss was the boss. You never questioned the boss. You were a robot. If he said do X, Y, and Z, you did X, Y, and Z. And if you didn't, you paid a big price. And so there was no dialogue or input or feedback. It was all top down, very siloed, very military. A lot of emotion, fear and anger and things like that. So when I was a young coach, I just mimicked my coaches, and I probably destroyed relationships or stunted relationships or painted myself in a corner because I was too authoritarian, too top down, too militaristic. The second thing was I was probably too rigid in my programming. I wrote really detailed programs, and halfway through the first week, it wasn't working. So it forced me over time to start writing program in ranges and percentages and whatnot so I could dial it in on the day, so to speak. So I think rigidity was a big problem when I was a young coach. I was married to the program. We were going to do the program come hell or high water, no matter what the weather, what their health was, what their mood was, what their focus was. It was like, hey, it's on paper, we got to get it done. And so, and probably the third thing was probably not having enough bandwidth to my technical models in the events. And so, what I mean by that, to develop a model for me, I look at the commonalities of a lot of athletes in that event, male and female, different ages. I look for what are the essentials that everybody's doing. Now, there's some variance in some of those key positions or moments, and we call that bandwidth. When I was a young coach, it was real strict as no, you got to be here, you got to do this. And now I allow for a little bit more wiggle room because people have different genetics, different training biases, backgrounds, different injuries they're fighting. Now, I'm not going to compromise on the components of the model, but I'm going to have a little bit of allowance or what I call bandwidth or tolerance in engineering to how strict we are in the model.
Awesome, coach. All right, those are three very interesting things to consider. And I want to pick your brain a little bit more now to the athlete side of it, because you've had the experience of coaching from the high school level all the way up to elite athletes that have gone on to medal at the most prestigious event in track and field, which is the Olympics, and coaching athletes from various sports. Here's what I would love to hear from you. There was a study done many years ago, and it's basically what they did was to poll coaches of former Olympians and try to figure out if they had any way of telling that the athlete would have gone on to become an Olympian or an Olympic medalist. And none of the coaches could have said, well, yeah, that kid, I knew that kid was going to make it. In fact, most of them could not figure out who was going to make it. But I'm going to ask, from your experience retrospectively, what qualities do you think help to determine whether or not an athlete makes it from the high school level or the national level all the way to the elite level?
Well, there's probably a lot of layers to that answer. First and foremost, is genetics. Like my max VO2 is 48. I'll never be a marathoner. I had the wrong parents to be a marathoner. And I got a very German body, so I'm going to be really quick and explosive and agile, but I'm going to burn out quick. So there's certain genetic ceilings. So, does the athlete have like potential? Now, in sprinting, all kinds of shapes, so it's not genetics on height or body mass or whatever, but there's certain things that you can't go away from. I think previous training history, what kind of programming they're in. We did a pretty good study in the UK looking at, who made European juniors and European worlds or under 17s and whatnot, and how many segued into senior success. And it was a really small number, is less than 10%. So we dug down a little bit deeper and say, why don't these kids transfer on and have success? And we found a couple of big rocks. One, the programming didn't adjust as the athlete aged and improved. So the programming stayed too rigid, or, it's kind of like we did this as a junior, we're going to do more of this as a senior. So they just jumped up the volume, or they jumped up the numbers of days training a week, or the intensity of the workouts. They just increased the load, stayed with the same program design. And so that program design, when you're young and bulletproof and can recover, may be overreaching or overtraining as you mature and get stronger and faster. So the program design was a big one. Another one was the expertise of the coach. Some coaches are really good about bringing kids through, primary school, middle school, and high school, but then their skill set and their understanding and their abilities don't match what you need to operate at a world-class level with a senior athlete. So do countries and programs hand over kids, or do they upskill that coach, to provide those services? So in the UK, they were anti-poaching. They didn't want to pass kids on. This is my meal ticket. I want to stay with this kid for life. So we figured in that paradigm, we got to upskill coaches so they know what really is going on at a world-class level in training and programming. So in the UK, most high schoolers are in a club system, so they train 3 days a week. They train Tuesday night, Thursday night, and Saturday morning. And so they would have success. They'd make world juniors, European juniors, they'd get on the podium and whatnot, and then they'd be identified as talented. And they would throw them into a senior program where now they're training 6 days a week and doing a lot more menu items than they did as a junior. And the machine broke. They burn out or they got injured. So I think in 88% of the cases that we studied, injury was the biggest variable in why the athlete didn't move on. Now we get into the source of the injury. Is it lifestyle? Is it biomechanics? Is it the programming? Or is it the sports medicine input? So there are variables there. So I think that probably a big reason athletes don't transfer on is the program and the expertise around the athlete don't evolve with the athlete. So in America, because of our system, we're a little different. We're used to athletes transitioning from coaches. So at age group, you might have a club coach. And then in middle school, you might have a middle school coach and a club coach in the summer. And then in high school, you probably have a high school coach or two and a summer coach. And then you go to university and you'll probably have one or two coaches because there's coaching turnover. And then by the time, so you're used to changing programs and coaching. You're more dynamic and you figured out what works for you, what didn't work for you and whatnot, because it's kind of a cafeteria. You've sampled all the food in the food line and you kind of know what you like and what works for you. Where in a lot of countries, it's that coach, that system, and it may work for a while, but as you mature, it may stop working, but you don't know what else to do because that's the only option on the menu.
Awesome. You touched on something quite interesting, Coach, in that, one of the examples you gave was, I think it was in the UK, you said the coaches were basically held on to the athletes for the duration of their time. And then the important thing was to upskill the coach. What do you think are the important, again, we're going to just go for the big rocks, the three are the most important things that a coach would need to upskill on generally if they have an athlete that they're going to have to take from the junior level to the elite level? Because I see that here in the Caribbean happening a little bit more often, where coaches at the high school level, now they have this elite performer who is, able to roll with the adults, and they're wanting to hold on to the kids to basically, I don't want to say it as a meal ticket, but they want to keep these kids in their training group, working with them for them at the elite level. So what are the major things that you would, or what major pieces of advice could you give to these coaches in terms of what you need to upskill on in order to be able to give good service to that kid and keep them moving towards their genetic potential?
Well, I kind of put that under the umbrella of environmental and sport knowledge. So do you know the history of your event, like what's been done before and what's being currently done and what's being done in the various camps of the world? And do you have the ability to identify the commonalities in those programming? So like if you study sprint systems anywhere in the world, France, Germany, UK, Japan, Korea, the Caribbean, the US, Canada, people do block starts, they do Excel runs, they do speed runs, and they do speed endurance runs. Those are essentials. Now, how do those variables change as the athlete matures into a senior? And how many times a week do you do it? How often do you do it? What are your ceiling numbers, your basement numbers, what ranges of intensity, so on and so forth. So it's kind of figuring out what is the landscape in programming? So a lot of coaches just know their landscape, their neighborhood, their postcode. I think getting a global overview of what's possible, what's being done, and some of it might be confirmation. Hey, I'm doing a lot of this stuff right, but I'm kind of missing these two or three things that's showing up on all these other systems. Maybe I got to find a way to plug that in. So programming would be one. Understanding the mechanics of their event. Having some form of technical model with some kind of bandwidth, and then probably the lifestyle issue. How do you influence the lifestyle of an athlete? So, if you're in college, your lifestyle is pretty dictated. You use so many hours in the classroom, you arrive at this time, then you do practice, and your meals are there. And then when you're a senior athlete, that structure's gone a lot of times. It's like, so that's a lifestyle issue, sleep hygiene, diet, nutrition, hydration. And then the big one for me is, how do you build a good medical team around your athlete? Because athletes are going to get injured or have niggles or have overuse problems or illnesses. And how do we manage that is critical. So I think if you do a history on Caribbean juniors, a lot of the ones that didn't segue on, it was an injury that stopped it. And so the injury was not dealt with in a timely manner or correct manner. And that person never got out of jail, so to speak.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point, because here on the islands, the typical boogeyman that is blamed is burnout or athlete burnout. In other words, they try to look retrospectively at all that the athlete did and put the blame there, to say, well, oh, well, this athlete was doing too much work as a junior, so this is the reason why they didn't transition, because they burnt out. And in reality, you're quite correct. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And sometimes it is for the coaches in the environment or in the orbit of the athlete to create that pathway to get them to the next level. Injuries.
Yeah, as a devil's advocate, I would say, okay, if kids are coming out of a system where they're overtrained, quote overtrained, well, how do you repair that process? You don't just throw your hands up and say, well, this kid will never make it. So I've had a lot of kids come to me that were burnt out, that were drastically overtrained and had injury upon injury, and have been able to resurrect careers because we have systems for pulling kids out of the mud or out of that deep well, and restore health and joy and happiness in training. So life happens, and you're always probably going to have a third of the kids that are overtrained and probably trained too sophisticated at too young an age for where they were at. That doesn't mean it's over. I think you can take those kids in a reboot program, bring them back to life, so to speak.
Yeah. All right, Coach. I have another question for you. More on the psychological aspect of preparing an athlete to move to the elite level. What is the key psychological trait that you think is important for athletes thinking of, becoming elite performers? It might be at the national level currently, or they might be at the top of their game at the high school level.
Well, I think two common streams I see in people at the elite level is they're calculated risk takers. They know when to take risk, whether it's in training or in a race or whatnot. They're very good at determining risk and when to take risk. And then probably a second stream is self-talk. So when people are on a roll and confident and whatnot, they think and talk to themselves differently than when they're in a slump or in a bad place. So the first two screens that I do is, where are we at on risk taking? If this person's fearful and afraid to train or do certain types of training or race against certain people, that's a risk taking puzzle that we got to figure out. And then on the other side of thing is the self-talk. Like, I have athletes kind of journal, like, what are you thinking about when you wake up? What do you think about when you're in the shower? What do you think about when you're walking to school? What do you think about when you're warming up? What do you think about during the practice? after practice, before you fall asleep. And I look for trends and patterns there. And so when things are going good, I kind of know how they're thinking and what they're thinking about. And usually they're thinking all over the place. They're not focused on one thing. When they're in a bad spot, they're reoccurring thinking over this problem or this issue. And it's a hamster wheel in their brain. That's all they think about all day long. So, I'll give you an example. Say you have a hamstring injury. If the athlete's afraid of that and it wasn't medically handled real well and the coach is oblivious to the return to play process, then that athlete's constantly thinking about the hamstring. And 9 times out of 10, they'll re-injure the hamstring because they're so tense and so obsessed with trying to protect the hamstring that they actually put gas on the fire with that thought process. So risk taking and self-talk are two really big streams. Probably a third stream was curiosity. Like the great ones I've had have been really curious about life and sport. They've become PhD students of their sport. They wanted to know a lot, sports psychology, physiology, biomechanics, sports medicine. They understood their craft and they had a burning desire. And even as they were retiring, they were still curious. And now, as parents and maybe volunteer coaches, they're still curious. They're still growing. So it might be my bias, but when I have people that are good risk takers with good self-talk and they nourish that curiosity, we're way ahead of the game.
Talking about being ahead of the game, Coach. Earlier you spoke about your influences as a young coach and the importance of having good coaching mentors, right? Could you elaborate a little bit on that in terms of what type of role does it play? Like one, having coaching mentors, how does it improve you as a coach, and how do you go about accessing those types of people into your network, especially more established coaches that might be very busy with their own path and their own career?
All right. Can you give me co-host so I can share the screen and put up a slide?
Okay, let me see if I can get it from here.
All right. Perfect. So this is a slide that I use as an overview on mentorship. So we'll look at this green column. So for me, first and foremost, a mentor provides advice, support, and they're coaching, in your role. They share inside information. They're not afraid to share the secret sauce, so to speak. They're a connector. They introduce you to other coaches and other disciplines and other people. I think too many times we're too narrow in our mentorship. We just want another sprint coach to be a mentor. And, I think there's value in having a throws coach and an endurance coach, a football coach, a cricket coach, in your mentorship programming, because coaching and teaching is coaching and teaching. And I think sometimes we get too biased in our discipline. A good mentor is an opportunity giver. So, they put you out in front in certain situations and let you shine, so to speak. And then lastly, they're an advocate. They support you and fight for you and whatnot. So in the coaching mentorship, yeah, sometimes people are too busy or whatnot. So that's why I think you need a diversity. So if I've got a coach and he can only have coffee with me 3 times a year, that's 3 times a year that's super valuable. I'll take that. But I can't get by on just 3 mentorship meetings a year. So that's why you got to diversify and build layers of mentors. And some are more available than others. Some have more expertise in certain areas. So like I said, Coach T was a huge science biomechanist mentor, and Victor was a big art of teaching mentor. And then I had peers in my mentorship group, colleagues like Lauren Seagrave, Gary Winkler, Vern Gambetta, Bob Myers, people like that, that were truly geniuses at their world. And so it was kind of a peer mentorship. I think another thing that a mentor does really well is they help you sit down and audit what you're doing. Do a yearly debrief or a cycle debrief and go through the ABCs. Hey, you're doing this really well. You're doing this so. Hey, you're kind of ignoring this, or you put this on the back burner. Why? So a good mentor is also a good auditor, if you will. And I think auditing is a critical component for coach development.
Awesome, coach. And of course, you are at Altis, big on coaching education, and now Altis has a program on mentorship. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we started out probably the wrong way. We started out really advanced, and now we call that level 3, but that's how we started. And the purpose of the program was to bring a group of coaches together, diverse coaching. So we had strength coaches and therapists and chiropractors and S&C coaches and sport coaches and all over the world. And we just come up with themes like, you know, how to use video correctly, how to define biomechanics, return to play, management, power struggles, communication with athletes, communication with staff members, politics with federations, Olympic committees, and sponsors. Just a broad palette of topics. And so it's a 9-month process, and we explore all these realms. But since then, we've kind of developed a level 2 and a level 1. So level 1's for beginning coaches, like, do you know the essentials of coaching? So it's kind of an audit and then a discussion on these areas that we have found consistently people have gaps. And then the level 2 is kind of for coaches that have been in it 5 to 10 years, that struggling on some things, doing other things really well. We're trying to build the portfolio, so to speak. And then the level 3 is for coaches who've been at it a while and see that there's more to coaching than just showing up with a whistle and a stopwatch.
Thanks for elaborating that, coach. I've been a part of that program. I think I was in the very first cohort, and it had a big impact on me. Not just from the lectures, not just from the mentorship time, but in terms of the network with those other coaches from all over the world. And we still follow each other, and we still communicate from time to time, with some more than others, but still having that network and learning how to build out that network of coaches from different regions and different interests and different sports. That has had a huge impact on me. In fact, it's a huge reason why I started this podcast, just to try and get more persons to interact with coaches from different fields and learn from each other. How would
I want to pause there. So we had a really interesting. We always have you guys do a debrief at the end of the course. What did you like? What didn't you like? What confused you? So on and so forth. And we had 2 endurance coaches, high school endurance coaches that were rock star coaches. They're well known and whatnot, and long career and what have you. And both these guys made the comment, we saw there were 3 rugby coaches from Ireland on this mentorship course. And we thought, what the heck are we going to ever get from these guys? Like, rugby's so far away from middle distance running, like, okay, we'll listen to them out of respect, but they don't have anything I can use. But both coaches said, I learned more from the rugby coaches than I did anybody in the group, because they had management problems, or they had sports medicine problems, or they had power struggle problems that I have that nobody talks about and they don't teach you in coaching school. So that's a big drumbeat for me, is like, diversify your network, have layers of the network. And I want to caution things. It can't be a one-way street. So a lot of mentees want to get, they got to give back. So I'm always on mentees, like, who are you now mentoring?
All right, coach. So how does someone get involved in or become a part of that mentorship program now? Because I mean, when I did it, it was maybe a more than a year ago, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you go to the Altus website, under, offerings and coaches and whatnot, and you scroll down, they have the various mentorship entry levels and requirements and things of that nature. And sadly, it's small groups because we're a small staff. We'd love to have a big group, but we kind of found about 20 people in a group's all we can manage because I do a lot of one-on-one calls and follow-ups and preparations and whatnot. So I'm probably spending 70 hours a month, just on mentorships. And then you service the other mentorship groups you've had previously. So we've been doing this for 5 years. And so on my uh, monthly email list where I check in on people or whatnot, I probably have 500 coaches now that we've been involved with. So, sadly, we can't do the numbers, but I think that eventually we get to people.
All right, Coach. Thank you so much for your time and being on here to share your knowledge and expertise with us. How can a coach get in contact with you if they, probably have any additional questions for you?
Yeah, so if you go to the Altus website, you should be able to find email addresses for every member of the staff, and we offer a lot of free content too. So people that are not ready to go all in, or maybe financially aren't ready to go in, there's a lot of free content on there. We have free ebooks and newsletters that we send out. So there's those options also.
All right, awesome, Coach. And I can always be found KingLeo.876, any social media platform that allows you to put a period in your social media handle. That's where I'm at. Thank you so much, Coach Taff, for spending a little bit of time out of your day to share with us on the Coaching Excellence podcast. We look forward to having you again in the future, maybe on a panel. Hopefully you can make yourself available for that, because you dropped a lot of gems on us today, and I'm absolutely sure that those coaches and athletes also, because I have a couple of athletes that I know message me and say that, they watch the podcast, that, they can draw a lot of insights from and help to improve their training into the future. All right. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
All right, I enjoyed it, and like I said, I really respect what you're trying to do and where your space is there in the Caribbean. So I'm here to help anytime.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Coach.
All right.